What if the clearest voice on freedom did not come from a throne, a senate, or a battlefield, but from a man born in chains? What if the most practical guide to inner sovereignty was written not for kings, yet quietly reshaped how emperors understood power, fear, and control? This is the unsettling question at the heart of our story. In a world obsessed with status, wealth, and dominance, how could a former slave teach rulers how to live free? And why, 2,000 years later, do his words feel more urgent than ever in an age of anxiety, distraction, and invisible cages? This film explores the life and philosophy of Epictetus, the Stoic thinker who turned suffering into clarity and powerlessness into wisdom. His ideas were not abstract theories meant for quiet libraries. They were forged in pain, tested under tyranny, and delivered with ruthless simplicity. Epictetus did not promise happiness. He promised freedom. Not the freedom of borders and flags, but the freedom no ruler can grant and no jailer can steal. Before we begin, if you value deep stories that connect history, philosophy, and the human struggle for meaning, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows us to create thoughtful content that serves the community. Epictetus was born around the middle of the 1st century in Hierapolis, a city in what is now modern-day Turkey. His life began not with choice, but with ownership. As a slave in Rome, he belonged to Epaphroditus, a powerful administrator under Emperor Nero. This detail matters because Epictetus did not observe power from a distance. He lived inside its shadow. He watched how emperors ruled, how fear flowed downward, and how cruelty often disguised itself as authority. At some point during his enslavement, his leg was badly injured, possibly crippled for life. Whether the injury came from abuse or illness, Epictetus never framed it as injustice. He framed it as reality. This is where his philosophy begins, not with protest, but with precision. Epictetus asked a question that destabilized the Roman worldview: who is truly free? The man who commands armies but trembles at insults, or the man in chains who governs his own mind? To him, freedom had nothing to do with social rank. Freedom was the ability to remain unbroken by events, untouched by fortune, and unconquered by fear. When Epictetus was eventually freed, he did not seek revenge or political power. He became a teacher. His classroom was informal, his language sharp, his tone uncompromising. Students came not to admire him, but to be challenged. Among them were future governors, military leaders, and members of Rome's elite. Ironically, the slave taught the masters, and the powerless shaped the powerful. What made his teaching revolutionary was its brutal clarity. Epictetus divided life into two domains: what is within our control and what is not. This distinction sounds simple, almost obvious. Yet most human suffering, he argued, comes from confusing the two. We try to control reputation, outcomes, other people's opinions, and the randomness of fate. When these inevitably slip away, we call it tragedy. Epictetus called it ignorance. He did not tell emperors how to rule provinces. He told them how to rule themselves. He warned that unchecked desire enslaves faster than iron chains. He insisted that anger is a confession of weakness, and that fear reveals misplaced values. To live freely, one must align desire only with what can be governed: judgment, intention, and response. This was not comforting philosophy. It was demanding. It stripped away excuses. It offered no external saviors. Yet, that is precisely why it endured. Epictetus spoke to something universal: the quiet realization that many who appear free are internally imprisoned, while some who suffer externally remain unshaken within. In the next part, we will enter the core engine of Epictetus's thought, the discipline of control, and see how a single idea became the foundation of Stoic freedom, influencing emperors, soldiers, and modern minds alike. At the center of Epictetus's philosophy stands a single, ruthless insight, one so sharp it cuts through centuries of confusion about happiness and power. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. Everything else is commentary. This idea, later called the dichotomy of control, was not meant as a comforting slogan. It was designed as a mental weapon, capable of dismantling fear at its roots. To understand why this mattered so deeply, we must remember the world Epictetus inhabited. Rome was not only an empire of stone and legions, it was an empire of unpredictability. Emperors rose and fell through intrigue. Favor could turn into exile overnight. Wealth vanished with a decree. Life expectancy was fragile, and violence was ordinary. In such a world, the illusion of control was deadly. Those who tied their peace of mind to outcomes were constantly at war with reality. Epictetus attacked this illusion without mercy. He taught that our bodies are not fully under our control, because illness, injury, and age will eventually claim them. Reputation is not under our control, because it lives in the mouths of others. Wealth is not under our control, because fortune lends and withdraws without apology. Even political power is not under our control, because it depends on forces larger than any single will. To stake one's freedom on these things is to volunteer for slavery. What then remains judgment? Intention. Choice. The ability to decide how we interpret what happens to us and how we respond. Epictetus insisted that no one can force us to adopt a belief, to desire what we judge unworthy, or to consent to despair. This inner territory, he argued, is inviolable unless we surrender it ourselves. That surrender, not misfortune, is the true loss of freedom. This teaching carried a quiet insult to emperors. If freedom depends on inner governance rather than external command, then absolute power becomes hollow. A ruler who cannot control anger, pride, or fear is not sovereign. He is managed by impulses more tyrannical than any rival state. In this way, Epictetus inverted Rome's hierarchy. The man who mastered himself outranked the man who ruled provinces. Yet, the discipline of control was not passive resignation. Epictetus never taught withdrawal from life or indifference to action. On the contrary, he believed clarity sharpened action. When we stop wasting energy resisting what cannot be changed, we become more effective where choice still matters. A general who accepts uncertainty plans better. A leader who accepts criticism acts with steadier judgment. A citizen who accepts mortality lives with urgency rather than panic. This distinction also redefined responsibility. Epictetus denied us the comfort of blaming fate for our inner turmoil. If we suffer because we crave admiration, that craving is ours. If we rage because events defy our expectations, those expectations were chosen. This was why his students sometimes felt attacked rather than inspired. Epictetus was not interested in soothing wounded pride. He wanted to rebuild the human mind on firmer ground. For emperors who listened, this teaching was transformative. It revealed that ruling others without ruling oneself was a contradiction. It showed that freedom is not granted by law, but earned through discipline. It exposed how easily luxury, praise, and fear can turn masters into dependents. In the next part, we will see how Epictetus transformed suffering from an enemy into a training ground, and why he believed adversity was not an obstacle to freedom, but its most reliable teacher. Epictetus never asked his students to imagine a world without pain. He asked them to imagine a mind that could stand firm inside it. This difference defined his philosophy. While many systems of thought promise escape from suffering, Epictetus offered something more unsettling and more powerful. He taught that hardship is not a punishment, not a mistake of the universe, but a form of training designed to reveal who we truly are. His own life gave this claim its credibility. Born a slave, living with a damaged leg, witnessing the cruelty and instability of imperial Rome, Epictetus did not theorize about suffering from a distance. He lived inside it. Yet he refused to treat his circumstances as evidence of injustice. Instead, he treated them as raw material. Just as an athlete strengthens muscle through resistance, the human character, he argued, is shaped by challenge. This idea overturned the emotional logic of his time. Romans admired strength, but they feared vulnerability. They worshipped victory and concealed weakness. Epictetus exposed this fear as another form of slavery. A person who cannot endure discomfort becomes dependent on comfort. A person who cannot face loss becomes hostage to what can be taken away. In this sense, suffering was not the enemy of freedom. Avoidance was. Epictetus taught his students to rehearse adversity before it arrived. Not to become pessimistic, but to become prepared. He urged them to contemplate exile, illness, poverty, and death, not with dread, but with curiosity. What would remain if these things occurred? The answer, always, was the same. Judgment would remain. Choice would remain. The capacity to act with dignity would remain. Everything else was negotiable. This practice had profound implications for those in power. Emperors and officials lived under constant threat of betrayal and downfall. Fear made them cruel. Cruelty bred resentment. Resentment fueled instability. Epictetus revealed a different path. A ruler who accepts the possibility of loss does not cling desperately to power. He governs with restraint because he is not trying to protect an illusion of permanence. His characters often argue brilliantly. They dismantle morality with precision. Yet their arguments leave devastation behind them. Dostoevsky shows that intelligence without humility becomes a weapon. The mind can convince itself of almost anything if it is desperate enough to avoid guilt. Reason becomes a shield against conscience rather than a guide to truth. This is not an argument against thinking. It is an argument against thinking without love. Dostoevsky believed that truth must be lived, not merely proven. A belief that cannot survive contact with suffering is not truth, but convenience. The moment an idea demands the destruction of human dignity, it reveals its emptiness. In a world increasingly governed by algorithms, optimization, and efficiency, Dostoevsky's fear feels unsettlingly modern. He asks whether a society that eliminates pain by eliminating freedom has truly progressed, or whether it has simply learned to hide its cruelty behind logic. In the next part, we will explore Dostoevsky's obsession with faith, doubt, and why he believed belief itself is a painful act of courage rather than comfort. For Dostoevsky, faith was never a peaceful refuge. It was a wound that never fully healed. He rejected the idea that belief exists to calm anxiety or explain the universe. True faith, in his view, begins exactly where certainty ends. It is born not from answers, but from the willingness to live without them. This is why doubt occupies such a central place in his philosophy. Doubt is not the enemy of belief. It is the price of belief. Nowhere is this tension more vivid than in the figure of Ivan Karamazov. Ivan is intelligent, compassionate, and morally serious. He does not reject goodness. He rejects a world in which innocent suffering is the cost of divine harmony. His rebellion is not against God's existence, but against God's justice. He refuses to accept any explanation that justifies the tears of a child. For many readers, Ivan feels like the most honest voice in the novel. Dostoevsky does not silence Ivan with easy theology. He allows the argument to stand in its full power. This is crucial. Faith that cannot face the strongest objections is not faith, but denial. Ivan's logic is devastating precisely because it is sincere. He is not seeking permission to be cruel. He is seeking a morality that does not demand innocent blood. Dostoevsky understood that this question has no logical solution that satisfies the heart. What separates Dostoevsky from both religious dogmatists and atheistic rationalists is his refusal to resolve this tension cleanly. He does not prove God through argument. He shows belief as an existential choice made in the presence of unbearable contradiction. Faith, for him, is not certainty that suffering has meaning. It is the decision to love despite the absence of guarantees. This is why love occupies a higher place than reason in Dostoevsky's hierarchy of values. Love does not solve the problem of evil. It responds to it. Where reason demands explanation, love offers presence. Where logic asks why, love asks who is hurting. Dostoevsky believed that no system, philosophy, or doctrine can replace the act of compassion between individuals. In his world, saints are not flawless believers. They are people who choose responsibility over resentment. They do not explain suffering away. They carry it with others. This is an exhausting vision of faith. It offers no shortcuts, no moral superiority, no escape from doubt. It demands engagement with pain rather than withdrawal into ideas. Dostoevsky feared a world where belief is replaced entirely by calculation, but he also feared a world where belief becomes rigid and merciless. Faith without humility becomes tyranny. Doubt without love becomes despair. The human condition, in his view, is to live permanently between these extremes. Epictetus insisted that desire reveals our philosophy even when our words lie. What we chase exposes what we believe will complete us. If that belief rests on unstable ground, freedom collapses. If it rests on character, freedom becomes unshakable. In the next part, we will see how Epictetus confronted fear itself, especially the ultimate fear of death, and why he believed that mastering this fear was essential for anyone who wished to live or rule without being controlled. If desire is the quiet tyrant, fear is its executioner. Epictetus understood that beneath most human anxiety lies a single, unspoken terror, the fear of losing what we cling to, and ultimately, the fear of death itself. He did not treat this fear with reverence or drama. He treated it as a misunderstanding, one that enslaves emperors and beggars alike. In Roman culture, death was everywhere yet rarely confronted honestly. Gladiatorial games turned it into spectacle. Funerals turned it into ritual. Philosophy often turned it into abstraction. Epictetus stripped away these layers and asked a question that unsettled his listeners. Why should death frighten us? If it is not within our control and not a moral failure to fear what is inevitable, he argued, is to argue with nature, and nature never negotiates. This idea was especially destabilizing for those in power. Emperors feared assassination, disgrace, and historical judgment. This fear drove them to paranoia and brutality. Epictetus saw this clearly. A ruler terrified of death cannot rule justly, because every decision becomes a defense mechanism. Mercy feels dangerous. Honesty feels risky. Letting go feels impossible. Epictetus approached death with cold clarity. Death, he insisted, is not an event to be experienced, but the absence of experience. Fear requires sensation, awareness, anticipation. Death contains none of these. What we truly fear is not death, but the stories we tell ourselves about it. The loss of identity, the end of pleasure, the judgment of others. Yet these are attachments, not realities. By dissolving the fear of death, Epictetus removed the final lever of control that the world holds over us. A person who is not afraid to die cannot be coerced by threats. He cannot be manipulated by promises of safety or longevity. This was why tyrants feared philosophers more than rebels. Ideas that dissolve fear weaken domination at its core. This did not make Epictetus reckless or indifferent to life. On the contrary, it made life sharper. When death is accepted, time becomes precious rather than terrifying. Actions gain weight. Integrity becomes non-negotiable. One does not postpone virtue for a future that may never arrive. Epictetus also taught that we rehearse death daily, not morbidly, but realistically. Every goodbye carries uncertainty. Every possession is temporary. Every role can be stripped away. To remember this is not to despair, but to loosen the grip of illusion. The world does not owe us permanence. Understanding this frees us from resentment. For emperors, this lesson was revolutionary. Power ends. Titles vanish. Statues erode. Only character survives, not in memory, but in the quality of choices made while alive. A ruler who accepts mortality governs with humility. A citizen who accepts mortality lives with courage. In the next part, we will explore how Epictetus transformed ethics from a social performance into an internal contract, and why he believed that true morality does not depend on surveillance, laws, or praise, but on something far more demanding. Epictetus did not believe that morality exists to impress others. He believed it exists to preserve inner freedom. This distinction separated him sharply from the moral culture of Rome, where virtue was often a public performance tied to honor, reputation, and legacy. For Epictetus, ethics began and ended in the private space of choice, long before applause or condemnation appeared. He taught that every situation presents a silent question. What kind of person will you choose to be here? This question does not require witnesses. In fact, witnesses often distort the answer. When morality depends on being seen, it becomes fragile. Remove the audience, and the virtue collapses. Epictetus wanted a morality that survived solitude, pressure, and loss. This was why he emphasized intention over outcome. A just action that fails due to circumstances remains just. An unjust action that succeeds remains unjust. External success, he argued, is morally irrelevant. What matters is whether one acted in accordance with reason and character. This view quietly liberated his students from the need for validation. Integrity stopped being a costume and became a discipline. For those in power, this teaching was deeply uncomfortable. Emperors were constantly watched, judged, praised, and feared. Their sense of right and wrong was often shaped by political necessity rather than principle. Epictetus confronted this directly. He warned that when morality bends to convenience, freedom dissolves. A ruler who lies to maintain order teaches himself that truth is optional. Eventually, he cannot trust even his own judgments. Epictetus framed virtue as alignment with nature, not in a mystical sense, but in a rational one. Humans, he argued, are social and reasoning beings. Acting against reason or against the common good fractures the self. Guilt, anxiety, and inner conflict are not punishments imposed by society. They are symptoms of internal contradiction. Vice is not dangerous because it is forbidden. It is dangerous because it destabilizes the mind. This view reframed ethical failure as a kind of self-harm. When someone acts unjustly, they damage their own capacity for trust, clarity, and peace. No amount of power or wealth can compensate for this loss. Epictetus insisted that a corrupt soul lives in constant fear because it knows it cannot stand openly by its own actions. Virtue, then, became the foundation of freedom. A person committed to honesty cannot be easily manipulated by lies. A person committed to justice cannot be bought cheaply. A person committed to self-control cannot be easily provoked. These qualities create a form of independence that no law can grant and no punishment can revoke. Epictetus also rejected the idea that morality is inherited or guaranteed by status. Being born into privilege does not confer wisdom. Holding office does not produce virtue. These must be trained daily through attention and effort. Ethics, for him, was not a theory to admire, but a practice to live. In the next part, we will see how Epictetus's teachings reached beyond his own lifetime, shaping emperors, influencing future philosophies, and quietly surviving the collapse of the world that tried to ignore him. Epictetus never wrote a book. This fact alone makes his influence extraordinary. Everything we know of his philosophy survived through the notes of students, most notably Arrian, who recorded his teachings with near-religious care. These words, spoken in modest rooms far from palaces, traveled where Epictetus himself never sought to go. They entered the minds of those who ruled the most powerful empire on earth. The most famous example is Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor of Rome. Marcus ruled at the height of imperial responsibility, surrounded by war, plague, betrayal, and political pressure. Yet when he wrote his private reflections, later known as meditations, the voice guiding his thoughts was unmistakably Stoic and deeply shaped by Epictetus. Again and again, Marcus returned to the same principles: control what is yours, accept what is not, govern your mind before governing others. This is one of history's great reversals. A man born a slave becomes the moral compass for a man who commands legions. Epictetus did not tell Marcus how to win battles or expand borders. He taught him how not to be destroyed by power. He offered a framework for remaining human inside an inhuman scale of responsibility. The endurance of Epictetus's philosophy reveals something crucial. Empires fall, institutions collapse, and technologies vanish, but the problem of the human mind remains unchanged. Fear, desire, anger, and insecurity did not disappear with Rome. They simply changed costumes. Epictetus's teachings survived because they address these constants, not temporary political arrangements. As Christianity spread and classical philosophy faded from public life, Stoic ideas were often absorbed quietly rather than celebrated openly. The language changed, but the structure remained. The focus on inner discipline, acceptance of suffering, and moral integrity without witnesses echoed across centuries. Later thinkers, soldiers, leaders, and writers rediscovered Epictetus not as a historical curiosity, but as a manual for resilience. What makes his legacy remarkable is its lack of coercion. Epictetus founded no movement, demanded no loyalty, and promised no salvation. His ideas spread because they worked. They gave people a way to stand upright in chaos, to act without panic, and to endure without becoming bitter. For rulers, this meant power without cruelty. For ordinary people, it meant dignity without status. Even the collapse of Rome did not silence him. His teachings passed through monasteries, libraries, and later into the modern world, where they resurfaced in psychology, leadership training, and personal development. Yet stripped of historical costume, the message remained unchanged. You are not free because of what you own, command, or control. You are free because of how you choose. In the final part, we will bring Epictetus fully into the present and ask why a philosophy born in slavery may be one of the most urgent guides for freedom in the modern world. We no longer live in an empire ruled by emperors, yet Epictetus feels closer to us than many modern thinkers. This is not because our world resembles his, but because the structure of human captivity has evolved. Chains are no longer made of iron. They are made of comparison, distraction, anxiety, and the endless demand to be seen, approved, and validated. In this sense, Epictetus may be more relevant now than at any point since his own lifetime. Modern life promises freedom through choice. Endless options, constant connectivity, limitless information. Yet this abundance has not produced calm. It has produced restlessness. Attention fractures. Identity becomes unstable. The mind is pulled in dozens of directions, each demanding emotional investment. Epictetus would recognize this immediately. To him, freedom was never about how many doors stand open, but about whether the mind can choose without compulsion. His core teaching remains brutally simple. If you tie your peace to what you cannot control, you will live in fear. Algorithms, public opinion, economic uncertainty, and global instability all operate beyond individual command. To anchor identity to them is to surrender autonomy. Epictetus does not ask us to ignore the world. He asks us to engage it without handing over our inner sovereignty. This is where his philosophy quietly resists modern despair. Epictetus does not deny injustice, loss, or suffering. He denies that these have the authority to define our character. Even now, a person can choose honesty over advantage, restraint over indulgence, courage over comfort. These choices may not guarantee success, but they guarantee dignity. And dignity, for Epictetus, was the true measure of a life. The paradox that opens this story now resolves itself. A slave taught emperors how to live free because he discovered something they often lacked. Power does not liberate. Control does not liberate. Freedom begins where fear ends. Epictetus was free not because Rome allowed him to be, but because he refused to hand his judgment to forces he could not command. This is the quiet invitation his philosophy extends across centuries. You may not control what happens next. You may not control how the world judges you. You may not control how long you live or what you lose. But you can control how you interpret, how you respond, and how faithfully you live according to what you judge right. That is the freedom no empire can grant, and no collapse can destroy. If this story gave you a new way to think about power, suffering, and inner strength, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue creating thoughtful historical films that connect the past to the challenges we face today. Together, we keep these ideas alive, not as relics, but as tools for living.